The purpose of the class simulation on the Chechnya situation was to gain insight of conflicts that deal with issues of identity, survival, and ethnic fears. Participants explored possible future directions of this conflict, the needs and interests of the two peoples, and the conditions and situations under which violence and the use of force might possibly be justified. When the issues are looked at from the perspective of each participant, it is easier to set up unofficial processes, so-called track 2 diplomacy, that address those fears and misunderstandings that fuel the conflict. Citizens diplomacy brings together influential members of the parties involved through joint analysis in order to come up with a resolution. The terms must be negotiated in a way that the communities will be able to follow on the ground. Ultimately, track 1 diplomacy is necessary for structuring and institutionalizing the peacemaking process. However, track 2 diplomacy is an excellent complement to the official process and can be quite helpful when government dialogues come to a standstill.
Chechnya is one of the most complex cases to analyze. Its importance is not only to show how Russia is part of the humanitarian crisis that the Chechen people found themselves in for centuries, but because there is very little hope that the various conflicting parties are going to be able to resolve this situation anytime soon. It seems almost like the Cold War put a freeze on the situation. In the meantime, Chechen ethnic nationalist feelings got even stronger and warming up rapidly. The Chechen-Russian conflict could set a precedent for other ethnic groups within the Russian Federation to pursue independence. Therefore, Putin must be really careful what the outcome of the Chechen resistance will be.
Another issue is that Chechnya is rich with oil. Even more important is the prevention of oil-rich Azerbaijan from slipping into Turkey's or Iran's sphere of influence. This has led to Russia's control both of the eastern end of the Caucasus and of the most of the oil reserves under the Caspian. The economic and political benefits of having Chechnya in the Russian Federation are significant. To keep the relative stability of the Federation, Russian government should start serious negotiations based on interest. The Chechen population is notably tired and exhausted from the ongoing fighting, the relocations under low humanitarian conditions, furthermore, starvation. It is in the best interest of Chechnya as well to start talks that must include all parties. The appeal should be Russia to grant Chechnya more economic and political power by signing a treaty similar to the Russia-Tatarstan one. The Checheno-Ingushes are natives of the Caucasus. Islam came to the Caucasus in the 7th century, but was not deeply rooted in the mountainous Chechnya until the 18th century. It is agreeable that the dominant ideology of Chechnya is not Islam, but nationalism. It unites 150 clans, which represent a sometimes contentious and largely egalitarian society. From the 13th century until the end of the 19th century, the Chechen people have always had to defend their land against foreign invaders. These centuries have molded their characters. Their bellicosity, independence, and courage were noted in Russian literature at the time of the Caucasian War in the 19th century, when the process of colonization of Chechnya began. The Chechen people originally had no religious affiliations. They were kind of like the Wild West, the natives who had no other laws to live by other than nature's and the wild vendetta that allowed clans to have justice in case of wrongdoing by others. During the Russian invasion, much of the population found refuge in the remote northeast Caucasian valleys, where their safety was guaranteed by the knowledge of the land. Russian troops tried to get into these areas to squash Chechen resistance without any success. Following a forced withdrawal from the area, Chechen families were able to grow in peace. In valleys just like what you see on the picture, on this slide, you could see some key dates from the Chechen history. As we discussed earlier, the Chechens were finally defeated and conquered by Russia by 1858. There was also a much more successful era after 1991, where the USSR failed and was too busy trying to keep it together. The Chechens did not hesitate and declared their independence, which lasted 3 years until finally the Russians recuperated from the economic and political downturn and realized that they need their territory politically and especially economically, and they cannot let independence happen for the Chechen people that they fought all their lives for. In 2003, a referendum was approved. The new constitution was drawn up between Chechnya and the Russian Federation. That also includes that any federation, under the federation, any republic, I should say member, is allowed to gain anytime independency and go back on its own, which obviously does not happen, and Russia would not let it happen. In the meantime, Russia is on the mission to destroy not only strategic points in Chechnya, but cutting down the entire population off from supplies of food and everyday necessities, and creating a human rights issue. None of the NGOs or IGOs representatives are allowed in the area. That leads again to a humanitarian crisis of the Chechen people who are at that time already dying from starvation. Some of those areas that we mentioned before, from the valleys especially, in those remote areas, the young Muslim population is growing so strong that they are able to actually participate not only fighting for their own independence, but also grouping up with jihadi fighters coming up from Afghanistan and even further down, Syria and that region, fighting together, not only training in Chechnya and further into Dagestan, but also they're able to send, Chechnya is able to send thousands of fighters into Syria to help the oppressed Syrian people against Assad regime. Given the history and the depth of the involved parties, the conflict affected the whole region in multiple levels, making the situation so complex that it has become very hard to detangle. On a primary level, there is the issue between Russia and Chechnya. On the second level, there is the Chechen government supporting Putin against its underground opposition fighting for its independence. Even the opposition is divided and stretched out to another type of cultural-based conflict between the Muslim opposition who wants to establish Sharia law and those who want to come out of the shadows to govern a sovereign Chechen republic, but not necessarily by religious rules. The religious Kabbat fraction got the conflict to the third level, which carries the conflict to an international scene where terrorism is a tool of fighting jihad and brings a bad reputation onto the Chechen rebels as a whole, and deems the group to be harmful in the eyes of the global community due to its terrorist connections. The concept of human security, including concerns for human rights, but broader than in its scope, has also become an increasingly important element in international law and international relations, increasingly providing a conceptual framework for international action. Although the issue is far from uncontroversial, the concept of security is now increasingly recognized to extend to people as well as to states. It is certainly becoming increasingly clear that the human impact of international actions cannot be regarded as collateral to other actions, but must be a central preoccupation for all concerned. Whether universally popular or not, there is growing recognition worldwide that the protection of human security, including human rights and human dignity, must be one of the fundamental objectives of modern international institutions. There are different approaches that scholars come up with to a successful resolution to these ethnic-based conflicts. One of them is by Jesse and Williams, whose solutions seem to be elevating the talks between communities into a system of interest groups that overlap each other and that way overcome the rising nationalism getting in the way of a solution. Part of the controversy over intervention derives from the potential width of activities this term can cover, up to and including military intervention. Some would regard any application of pressure to a state as being intervention and would include in this conditional support programs by major international and financial institutions whose recipients often feel they have no choice but to accept. Some others would regard almost any non-consensual interference in the internal affairs of another state as being intervention, including the delivery of emergency relief assistance to a section of a country's population in need, which would be equivalent to the Chechnyan situation. Russians would definitely view this as intervention and would not let that happen. Others, again, would regard any kind of outright coercive actions, not just military action, but actual or threatened political and economic sanctions, blockades, diplomatic and military threats, and international criminal prosecutions as all being included in the term. Yet others would confine its use to military force. Ramsbottom, Woodhouse, and Mile came up with the book Contemporary Conflict Resolution with some 8 intervention principles that are very well described, how useful they can be, although even the authors admit that they disagree about the ethical legitimacy of forcible intervention in conflict resolution work. When intervention decisions are made, there is an unavoidable moral responsibility that falls on the intervener or interveners, whether the outcome of the negotiations is positive or negative. All principles mentioned in the book, based on the previous scholarly observations, are standing and follow a lot of logic. When applying these theoretical rules of intervention to real-life cases, the challenges become very visible, furthermore causing the practicality of them questionable, as the most difficult task to practitioners prove to be to put the developed theories into practice and expect the result to align with its predicted result. Each conflict is unique, which requires to apply these principles or some of these principles at different levels. The conflict resolution strategies have to be customized accordingly. There must be more than one path to resolution explored that should be adjusted creatively along the process. It is extremely important when trying to apply these principles to a conflict for the involved parties to remain flexible enough to be able to have other tries at a resolution. Certainly, just interventions will not be just in the eyes of the whole community. The intervener tends to have more than just the reach of helping hand in the conflict under the flag of humanitarian crisis. It is one of the most important principles, the principle of impartiality, that pose the biggest challenge at the same time in an intervention. Throughout history, there were many conflicts that presented an example of how deeply interest is involved in decision-making processes and interventions. It raises the question if politics is made up from all the interest-driven alliances and actions between power groups, how can we leave them out of conflict resolutions? If we take interest out of the equation, we would get Rwanda, where there was no intervention, even though everybody knew there's a genocide undergoing. It seems interest can be a good motivator and possibly a necessary variable. Conflict resolution is a very complex and sensitive process to be involved in. There is no developed mechanism that would fit all. Therefore, a planned intervention has to be planned out thoughtfully, considering as many variables as possible from beginning to end. The end does not mean the end of the intervention. The end involves all the activities that must follow after, such as peacekeeping, rebuilding, and enabling new political and economic development with the help of NGOs and IGOs.